Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest M-SARA webinar. My name is Jenny Parks, and today's webinar is the SARA Institutional Application, How to Apply, Renew, and Comply. For those of you who've been doing SARA work for a few years, you will recall that I did a SARA, an application webinar a few years ago, but some things have changed and we've refined our processes, so I thought, hey, it's good to go ahead and update this thing. Also, we get a lot of questions from folks at institutions who are new to SARA, or they might be new to their position and therefore be taking on SARA duties having never experienced them before. So I wanted to be able to offer this webinar to folks who are in that position as well. And then, as with all of our webinars, it will be stored on the M-SARA website where you can access it and all of the supporting materials at any time. So hopefully this will become a resource that you and the folks at your organization can rely on. All right, well, this is me. As I just said, welcome to the webinar. And along with me today, not just Jenny Parks, but also Emily Jacobson, our M-SARA coordinator. And Emily will be helping us with the chat feature. For those of you who've done our webinars before, you will recall that we do chat via the typed chat boxes, and we will answer those questions at the end. Emily will answer them along the way as she is able, and then we'll try to get to as many of them verbally as we can. The structure of the webinar is that it will be a 60-minute presentation and then up to 30 minutes of question and answer at the end. Within that 60 minutes, this will be the structure of the webinar. The first part will be the SARA Institutional Application and the application process. Part 2, the institutional renewal application and process. And Part 3, complying with SARA, doing what you agree to do on the application so that you remain in good standing with SARA. And then, of course, questions and answers. So let's dive right in. Part 1, the SARA Institutional Application and application process. So one of the most important things is to know where to find the application. I don't get too many questions about this one, but I always like to make sure that people know. You can always access it on the NC-SARA website, and I generally recommend that you do that. That's going to be the most updated version. Most of your portal agencies in your states are also going to have a link to that website. Occasionally they're going to have their own version of it that they house on their website, and it might not always have the most up-to-date version of the NC-SARA application. For instance, I know early in the new year, January or February, they're going to be adding a couple of fields to the application, and I will tell you about those today. But if there were an overlap in that application between the time that a state entity would have it and update it versus when it would be available at the national level, that's always a consideration. What you will need to always go to your state level website for are any supporting materials. I've taken an example here from the Illinois Board of Higher Education website. They are the portal entity in Illinois, and they have some, not necessarily additional requirements, but they have a nice check sheet where when you do need to present things like your financial score or some other documentation, they have some nice guidelines there for you and ask that you initial those things as well, because they are also the entity in the state that approves institutions in general, not just for SARA. So, and I would say that that's very common among portal agencies around the nation. So it's good to check in both places and always make sure that you have the most up-to-date version of the application. You can also go on the NC-SARA website and look at the nifty little graphic they've got there. This will give you the steps in the process. The steps I give to you today will not directly correspond to these because I'm breaking the steps down into more detail, but it should look roughly like what I'm going to give you. The links for all of these things, the NC-SARA website, the specific link for this diagram, will be available on a list of links that accompany this this webinar. So you're going to be able to find those. So again, there's another little graphic if that helps you. So I like to break the idea of the SARA application down into 3 parts. Items requiring documentation, items requiring verification, and items requiring affirmation. When people come to the NC-SARA institutional application, I would say one of the very first phone calls I'll get is one where someone says, hey, Jenny, I know I'm doing something wrong. This only took me about 15 minutes. What am I doing wrong? And I have to tell them each time, you're not doing anything wrong. If you had all of your materials together and just needed to complete the application, 15 minutes sounds about right to me. And one of the reasons is because we have piggybacked on other documentation and information that's already out there. We're not asking for anything duplicative with SARA. And also because we wanted it to be streamlined. SARA is supposed to save you time and money and risk and hassle, and the application is constructed that way. So again, when in doubt, if you think you've done too little, probably haven't. I mean, it never hurts to reach out and double check, but that's just something that could maybe alleviate a little bit of stress and consternation out there amongst those of us who work in the compliance field. So let's go right to the items requiring documentation. There are only 3 of them, and they're pretty straightforward. Item number 1 is the proof of institutional domicile. So in SARA, as you know, if you're familiar with it, and if you're new to it, I'll explain, rather than applying to get state authorization to offer distance education in every other state where you serve students, you're going to apply to your home state where you have a portal entity, which will basically verify that you are able to participate in this nationwide reciprocity agreement. And so as you are doing that, you will be documenting that that state is actually the state that is the right one to whom you should apply. Believe it or not, we do have institutions that have bought branch campuses or have multiple campuses in multiple states, and as a result, those same people, sometimes it's not always clear what the home state is. For 99% of you out there, though, it's going to be pretty straightforward. If you're a public institution, there's a good chance that your institutions were created somewhere in state statute. Sometimes if you are older than the state itself or before there were some statutes, these will be some of the nonprofit organizations, you're likely to have an institutional charter somewhere, or a charter from a religious organization. If you are a for-profit institution or even some other hybrid sorts of organizations, you might have a corporate charter. And of course, there are still yet other documents that could give you an official grounding and location authorization to operate in a certain state. And in some states, you might not even need to offer this documentation. This is one where you could check with your portal entity. For example, I used to do this kind of work for one of the University of Wisconsin system schools. In all likelihood, I haven't checked with DLAB, but they're probably pretty familiar with the statutes in Wisconsin that created the school I worked for. And so that would be an interesting question for me to ask them retrospectively. But in most instances, especially for public institutions, there's going to be something with which the portal entity is pretty familiar. It never hurts to attach this documentation, even if you think they're already familiar. And then you could possibly ask on your renewal the following year if you need to attach it again. But that's going to depend, as with many things, on the way your portal entity operates. The second item that requires documentation is item number 2 on the application. And that's going to be the proof of your accreditation. Now remember, one of the requirements to participate in SARA is that you be accredited by an accreditor that's recognized by the U.S. Department of Education. And that can be all regional accreditors and many national accreditors. So the very best piece of documentation is just your most recent letter from your accreditor that says you're in good standing and you're fully accredited. Or maybe you're accredited, but you're on some type of provisional status. It doesn't matter. That still counts for SARA. And you want to give that letter with the most updated status. You want to include that with your SARA application. Now, for those of you, again, who might be new to this sort of a position and you're not really sure where to get that, there are probably 2 good ways to do this. First of all, you can talk to the accreditation liaison at your school. They will almost definitely have that information pretty readily at hand. You can look at the file where all of the accreditation materials are from your last reapproval and site visit. It might be there. You can also, at least I know for the for many of the national accreditors and for all the regional accreditors, you can literally just log onto the website and look for that documentation. So that should give you some ideas of the types of documents and where you can find them. All right, the third document, the third type of documentation is going to be item number 3, and that's going to be proof of your federal financial responsibility composite score. And this will apply only to private institutions because public institutions do not receive such a score. This is the score that the U.S. Department of Ed calculates in order to look at which sort of category your school will fall into in order to receive Title IV funds. And that means that the person at your school who is most likely to have this score and know about it will be your financial aid director or officer. They will be the ones who have the most ready access to this. These letters would usually arrive in the fall of each year, around September. And often, depending on the region where you are in the country, because there are all of the regional offices, you might not at your school you might not receive a letter if your score, I should say, is not below 1.5. So sorry, that's a typo. Usually you won't receive a letter if your score is not below a 1.5. And that's because above a 1.5 they assume you're in good standing, it's fine, you're going to have kind of a normal standard Title IV arrangement. Below 1.5 there start being different cash monitoring situations and different bonding situations where you have to, or letters of credit where you have to do some additional things to ensure that you're going to are able to take good care of those Title IV funds. So continuing with this tends to be one of the pieces of information that people do have the most difficulty finding and understanding. So once again, it's only for private institutions. It is connected to your ability as a school to offer financial aid. One of the things that you can do is possibly look up the most recently published score. These are put on the U.S. Department of Ed website each March. And again, the link to that website is provided in the list of links that accompany this webinar. There is another option I've also recently become acquainted with. There is an email address called Easy Audit, and that is also on the list of links and resources that accompany the webinar. Your financial aid director would be the one who could email in and get this, but there is a way to email that address using your OPED ID number, which we will discuss in a few minutes for those of you who might not know what that is, and they could make you a contact so that you could get this information and receive at this website you're able to get the last 3 years of scores documented. So that's another way that you can get this documented score because, again, for those of you who aren't as familiar with SARA, if you have a financial score of 1.5 or above, that's another requirement to be in SARA. If you have a financial score of 1. Actually, I think I do that in the, yep, there we go. The next slide tells us all about it. If you have a financial score between 1.0 and 1.49, that is an area, again, not only will the feds begin to ask for some additional things from the school, so will SARA. There could be additional documentation required by your portal entity. And you're going to have to contact your portal entity about that because they're going to want to see different things. They're going to have their own way of taking a look at all of those financial ratios and risk factors. So again, that would be one where you would reach right out to them. All right, moving on. We are going to the parts of the application that require verification. So these are not things where you're going to attach any type of documentation or evidence, but you, as the person filling out the application, need to verify that before you ask the signatory agent, and that's going to be a provost, a chancellor, a president, some other high-ranking chief academic officer, you need to verify that the things they're going to put their initials next to and signing off on are still up to speed and are what you're going to present them and say, yeah, we're good on these. So item number 4 is one of the most difficult parts of the application. Again, it's not difficult in and of itself, but it does confuse people and worry them sometimes. So what you're doing on item number 4 is asking your signatory agent to verify that the institution is in compliance with the C-RAC guidelines. and that is the Council on Regional Accreditors Guidelines for Best Practices in Distance Education. They are appended to the end of the application, so when you download or take a look at the application on the NC-SARA website, those last few sets of pages that really go through those guidelines. There are 9 of them. And I always recommend that you go ahead and compile a file of documentation on C-RAC compliance so that you can educate and verify for your signatory executive that this work has been done, because it is very common for someone in the highest levels not to be this intimately familiar with aspects of accreditation or distance education. So it's really important before they sign their name that they see that. One of the places you can look for this is in all of your regional accreditation paperwork, because if you are regionally accredited, you've already been essentially examined for compliance with C-RAC guidelines. So someone at the school has already worked on this. Odds are, however, because the 9 C-RAC guidelines are woven throughout the regional accreditation standards, it's not all going to be in one place, and that's where you could pull it together and be able to demonstrate to your signatory executive that, yes, we do comply with these, and this is how. And if anyone ever questioned us, we just get this little file out, and we're good to go. Another item requiring verification is item 10. You need to verify that your institutional practices regarding professional licensure disclosures are up to speed and are compliant and are approaching best practices. There really are 2 SARA options you are given as you read item 10, but there's a lot of misunderstanding for this, and I do anticipate some clarification on this issue coming forward from NC-SARA in 2018. So essentially what you are provided on the SARA application and in all of the SARA manual materials and in the Unified Agreement is that if you have courses and programs leading to professional licensure, the onus is always on the school to make sure that those courses and programs will lead to licensure in the state where students are located. And basically you have to reach out to the professional licensing boards in these other states and find that out, whether it's for teacher education, nursing, physical therapy, etc. If you find that your program does not meet standards, that's fine, disclose that. If you find that it does, go ahead and get the approval and state that it does meet professional licensure requirements. It is not uncommon, however, to reach out to a board of social work or teacher ed somewhere and not really be able to connect with the right person or get a timely answer. So in the event that you've made a good faith effort to establish that connection and find out, SARA does give you the option of saying, hey, we've reached out, we continue to try to find this out, but you're signing up from a state where we can't guarantee you that our program will let you sit for your exam or apply successfully for a license to practice. The problem is that some people interpret that second option there, that option of telling the student, hey, we haven't been able to figure this out, here's the contact information for the agency. Unfortunately, schools have said, we're just going to do that with all of them. We're not going to reach out. We're going to kind of leave that on the students. That is not best practice, and if you just step back and think for a second, it's hard enough for those of us working in this field to take a course of study and a program and have a conversation with someone in another state about that to determine if they actually will meet licensure requirements. Imagine how much more difficult it is then for a student. So since SARA was created to make life better for students, and I choose to think that all of us in the higher ed realm also want what's best for students, this is not the best approach to take. I understand that people do this because they don't have time and they don't have staffing, but this is not the intent, and so you have to go ahead and remember that it is on the institution to find these things out, if at all possible. Adding to that, there are new federal regulations on the state authorization of distance education that include much more structured and specific guidelines for professional licensure disclosures. If those regulations go into effect on July 1st, 2018, as they are scheduled to do, and of course there are a lot of changes in the department, there could be changes to these rules, there could be some delays, we don't know. But as of now, July 1st, 2018, the new federal regulations have many more specific requirements for professional licensure disclosure, and they specifically do not allow you to leave it up to the student to find out or figure these things out. What I generally recommend is always to aspire to best practices in these areas, and the new federal regulations really are best practices. They're very student-friendly. I recommend the resources of the State Authorization Network, and I also recommend possibly a membership with that network. They are the people doing the most work and the best work in this area. On the set of links and resources that accompany the webinar, I do have links to SAN and to some of their papers specifically on this topic. Another item requiring verification is going to be your OPE ID number. That's the Office of Post-Secondary Education ID number. And this is the 6-digit number that you receive when you participate in Title IV programming. Many of you might be very familiar with the OPE ID number, but try to remember that some of the newbies in the compliance world are coming from another sort of compliance, or they're coming from another part of the institution, and they might need to fill in this number on a SARA application, and they don't know what it is and where to find it. So you can look it up on the Federal Student Aid website, and again, look at that list of links, and you'll see it there. Please try to be accurate with this. One of the things, I've done a lot of work with data in the SARA universe in the last few years, and as I'm trying to clean up and match schools and different databases based on the OPE ID numbers, I can tell you that is the single most difficult thing. If I don't have an accurate OPE ID number to be my my unique identifier for the records, it's very difficult. So it's good for data and record keeping to be as accurate as you can with that OPE ID number. Another thing you need to verify is what your latest fall FTE from IPEDS is, FTE, full-time equivalent. Again, for those of you new to this, I apologize for any of the folks for whom this is old hat, but I want to make sure that people who are new have these terms and know what they mean and how to use them. So this is the latest number posted for your fall full-time equivalent enrollment, and it's reported to IPEDS. And it's important to remember this is not the number of students enrolled. That would be unduplicated head count. Full-time equivalent is taking all the undergrads and the part-times and someone just taking one course and adding them up to however your institution defines that undergrad number. Usually it's 12. So if you have someone taking 6 credits and 2 other people each taking 3, that's 1 FTE, even though it would be 3 unduplicated head count. But FTE is the number you use. This is how you tell which fee category you fall into for SARA purposes. What I would do in order to make sure that you have good, accurate, and recent information on IPEDS is to establish, contact, and cultivate a relationship with your institutional research department. Odds are they're the people who are going to be submitting IPEDS numbers throughout the year, and so they're going to have this information. This number is not only necessary for your SARA application or renewal application, it is also a number you're going to need when you report data to SARA in May of each year. Plus there will be other IPEDS fields you'll need access to at that time, so it's always good to take coffee and cookies to the people in institutional research. And I have no ulterior motive there, having been an IR person, but it is nice to get the coffee and cookies in exchange for the IPEDS numbers, just putting that out there. Okay, another item that requires verification on the SARA application. You are required to put a link to the complaint system and process at your institution. I get a lot of calls about this. This was not something that was on the original application. This came later, but it's very, very important that the portal entity be able to take a look and find out if the complaint process for students that you have posted on your website meets federal and state requirements, and if it meets SARA requirements. And so I've got it on there because people will say, well, is this the state? What link do they want, the state or the federal or the DOD? So it is your institutional complaint process. And students need to be able to lodge a complaint about some aspect of their experience at the institution. They also need to know if that complaint is not resolved to their satisfaction at the institutional level and they've exhausted that process, where they can go above that. So a couple of comments about that. First of all, this link should be very easy for students to find. It should not be embedded too many layers deep. They shouldn't have to click too much. And I always recommend that it be easily searchable on the website. Second of all, it needs to distinguish between the SARA and the non-SARA processes, which will not vary at the school level, but above the school level it would. For SARA students from other states, if they want to appeal any type of complaint resolution at the institutional level, they will go to the state portal entity in the state where the institution is located, not to the entity in the state where they are located. And this needs to be very clear for students in the place where all of these processes are posted. And of course, the process that is posted needs to comply with state and federal regulations and with accreditor requirements. All right, moving from verification, just making sure everything's good and up to speed, and that you don't need those verification items. Once again, you don't need documentation, but you want to make sure that you're recommending to your signatory executive that those things are in good shape. Now we're just moving on to things that require affirmation. Essentially promises that the executive is making that the school agrees to abide by. So, and that's everything else on the application. So we can go through those pretty quickly. The institutional leader will agree to be responsible for the actions of all third-party providers you use to serve your SARA students. I sometimes get calls about this and people are perplexed and concerned. And what we always have to tell them is we have yet to encounter a third-party contract where this is not already part of the way the contract is constructed. So I always try to alleviate some stress and worry there just by saying that this is a default setting on most third-party contracts. You also have to agree to notify your home state of any negative changes in your accreditation status. You have to agree to comply with SARA data reporting, and that's going to happen in May of each year, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the webinar. You need to work with the state to resolve student complaints. So once again, if a student complaint exhausts the institutional process and escalates to the portal entity, you need to agree to work with them to resolve it. You can also log on to the NC-SARA website and see how few complaints actually rise above the institutional level. So if you did have a signatory officer who was concerned about this, that would be a good piece of information to share with him or her. You have to provide a reasonable alternative for any educational services not provided to the students. So this could be in the event of a school closure or a catastrophic event. And again, we'll talk about that more at the end of the webinar. And the last two items requiring affirmation, you have to agree to pay state and national SARA fees, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. And you have to abide by any provisional approval conditions if they are necessary. And we didn't talk about approval conditions yet because we haven't gotten to the approval process. We'll get to that, and so that will make more sense in a few minutes. Okay, so let's say you've done all these things. You've got your documents, you've done your homework. So that's step one. Then you're going to have a request. You're going to have to set in motion some type of request to get your funds. I know, having worked at a public institution before, that can take sometimes 6 to 8 weeks, depending on which set of funds it's coming from, how much it was anticipated, etc. And so I always say to get that started as early as you think you possibly can. The state fees are going to vary by state. and they can be found on the NC-SARA website. I provide the link on that, that sheet that accompanies the webinar. The national fees, as I had mentioned, are determined by the category of FTE that you fall into. So if you have fewer than 2,500 FTE, you will pay an annual fee to SARA of $2,000. If you have between 2,500 and 9,999 students, it will be $4,000, and above 10,000, it will be $6,000 a year. Then fill in the application and make an appointment with your signatory executive to present and discuss the application. Most of the time, for most people, I find this is a very straightforward process, but if you have a signatory executive who is unfamiliar, it could take longer. So again, try to know what you're in for and build in the time for that process. Once that signature is obtained, you're going to want to send in the application and any possible state fee to the state portal entity. That is a place where people commonly make a mistake. They will send it to NC-SARA rather than to the state portal entity. So just remember, the states are the ones reviewing your applications. Then you're going to wait for contact from the state portal entity. They might come back with a request for more information, or just a straight approval, or a conditional approval. And if they request more information, just have the conversation with them. Often it is just that they wanted to see something else, or that there was a slight misinterpretation of what was wanted on the application. This tends to be a very friendly and collegial conversation, so I would just respond to them as quickly and politely as you can. And then hopefully the next step will be an approval, and that's going to provide you with some instructions for the NC-SARA part of the approval process. It will be a letter that you will use to log into the NC-SARA system and activate your institutional account. Now, don't let more than 60 days lapse between when the state portal entity basically provides you with this information and when you actually activate the account, or else you're going to have to start the that account will expire within 60 days if you don't go on the NC-SARA website and get that done. When you activate your institutional account, NC-SARA will send you an invoice. You're going to need to pay that invoice within 60 days of the date of receipt. When those funds clear at NC-SARA, the institution will be added to the official list of SARA participants, and you will receive a welcome letter that will provide you with general information and a logo that we ask that you put on your website so that students can see that indeed you are a participating SARA institution. And again, links that are relevant to all of these things are in that accompanying document. Common application problems. Well, I think I alluded to this one already. Overthinking the application, especially the C-RAC guidelines. I will, and I'll come back to the C-RAC guidelines briefly in part 3. But people do overthink it and try to do more, and so they cost themselves, again, time, confusion, and energy when they're trying to make it harder than it is. There is also generally a problem if the person completing the application is new to the position or lacks access to the necessary information. I think I've mentioned that. Or if an executive is unfamiliar with SARA, or at least with components of the application. And then sending the application and the fee to NC-SARA rather than the state portal entity. Those are really the things that I've noticed are the biggest mistakes that get made and make it more difficult to get this done in a timely manner. All right, taking a quick break here. We'll start with part 2, the institutional renewal application and renewal process. All right, where to find the renewal application? Well, on the NC-SARA website, and some of the state portal entities will also have it on their website, and I would say that the same reminders from before, which is to make sure that you have the most up-to-date website and all the appropriate attachments for the state. Just go ahead and make sure of that. It is important to know that these two applications are different, and if you don't use the right one, it can delay your process. So again, remember that there are two different ones, the initial and the renewal application. That is something I see people doing. So go ahead and try to remember to use the correct application for whatever it is you are doing with SARA. There's also a nice little graphic of the SARA renewal process. That comes from the NC-SARA manual. Again, it's a little bit more abbreviated than what I presented, so please don't be confused by that. But again, I always like to offer a graphic version of anything because I know I'm a graphic and a visual learner, so hopefully that will help. All right, so this is a recommended renewal process timeline, and I'm recommending this as a regional SARA director because I find that if you can stick to this timeline, things will go most smoothly from an institutional perspective. NC-SARA will send you a renewal notice 90 days prior to your institutional expiration date. They will send this to all of the folks who are your institutional contacts that are logged into the NC-SARA system. So you want to make sure that those contacts are up to date, and you might even want to try to schedule a reminder to make sure that this doesn't fall through the cracks. One of the things that I do get concerned about for some institutions, because I've seen this happen, is that maybe only one person is listed as a contact. That person leaves the position. They close down that email. Those contacts don't get updated at NC-SARA at the portal entity, and so the renewal notice goes, to nowhere, and the institution just doesn't think about it, and it doesn't stay on their radar. So you want multiple contacts. You want them updated at NC-SARA and at the portal entity, and you want to make sure that you get these expiration notices and renewal notices. I recommend that within 30 days of receiving that notice that you try to submit the renewal application and the state fees to the state portal entity. That's going to give you a whole 60 days to deal with anything that comes up in that process. It could be a request for more information, especially if you've had a change in accreditation status, or maybe your institution is temporarily at a lower score for their financial score. There just could be a number of things, or the portal entity might be backed up. They might have other things they're working on that generally this is not their only duty. So it's always good to give yourself as much time with this as you can. And then at 30 days, you will receive an additional reminder from NC-SARA. Hopefully, about 30 days out, the portal entity will be able to inform NC-SARA and the institution of approval or provisional approval. And then you'll have that next 30 days to get payment and registration and re-registration in with NC-SARA. If you follow a non-recommended timeline for the renewal process, these are some of the things that happen. If you are not renewed at NC-SARA by your expiration date, but you have been approved by your state portal entity and they've gotten that information to NC-SARA, a 30-day grace period can be granted. And then it's a scramble to get that done. Within 5 days of that grace period ending, if you have gotten gotten the fees paid and gotten everything done with NC-SARA, you're fine, but you will have to pay a 25% late fee. If there is no renewal within that 5 days after the grace period, you're out of SARA and you have to wait 180 days to reapply. And these are significant penalties, and they are designed to make sure that institutions are staying on top of this process, completing it in a timely fashion, and that there's not a gap in their state authorization coverage. So just a few broad notes on the renewal process. It is easier and shorter than the initial application, but do build in a time buffer for the process, as I've mentioned. Keep all your institutional contacts updated, and keep up with relevant items throughout the process. Again, changes in accreditation. If your complaint system has changed or the links have changed, those types of things, it's going to make it much easier for you to complete this application if you've kind of at least kept an eye on these things during the year. All right, Part 3, complying with SARA once you've completed the application and joined. And i.e., it's just doing what you agree to do on the application. First first of all, the very best thing you can do for all of these things is to optimize your institutional processes. And these will benefit you in not just SARA work, but in other state authorization compliance work, professional licensure compliance work, etc. You want to establish good working relationships between your department and institutional research, your academic departments, where you're going to need to get a lot of your information. Information technology, they're going to help you make sure that you've got updates on the website that meet SARA and federal and state requirements. Obviously, you have to have a good working relationship with leadership. They are the ones who sign the application. They're also the ones who can make sure that you get the data and the information you need from others. I'm not going to say that people are uncooperative with data, but sometimes they're not as quick and as forthcoming in getting you the information you need as you might need for it to be. And the leadership can help a lot with that. And admissions. Admissions people basically know who's coming in from where do we have students, where do we need to be thinking about these things. And actually all parts of the institution probably would be good for you to have connections with. I didn't put financial aid up there, but again, they're going to help you with that financial score, etc. And you want to not just have a good relationship, but you want to establish a regular flow of data between your office and these other parts of the institution so that you are getting the most recent update on IPEDS figures, the most recent version of the accreditation paperwork, etc. You also want to keep up with state authorization in general, and that would include SARA webinars, SARA newsletters, looking at the blogs from WCET and working with the SAN network or looking at their blogs and their resources. And again, I've got links to those organizations and those resources on the document that accompanies this webinar. So keep up with state authorization and then keep up with SARA. A lot of people get confused, well, if we're in SARA, do we need to deal with state authorization? And the answer is yes. First of all, we still have 2 states that are not members of SARA. And so everything you do in Massachusetts and California requires you to follow a traditional state authorization process. And there are activities that fall outside the scope of SARA, and you might be engaged in those activities in other states, in which case there's the potential that you'll be dealing with that state in a traditional non-SARA manner. So again, stay current in the field so that you understand where the lines are, or that you at least know whom to ask if you're unsure. Okay, so I did say a number of times I'll get back to the C-RAC guidelines. This tends to be, again, a place where a lot of people get worried and they get confused. So as I said, the guidelines are appended to the end of the application. They come out of the Council of Regional Accreditors. They are a set of best practices in distance education, and they are embedded in regional accreditation policies. I recommend, as I said before, creating a document or a notebook with this information for your signatory officer. And I always like to remind people there are 9 numbers, and under each number there are a bunch of little bullets. And I have people calling me sometimes in a panic saying, do we have to do each of these bullets? We can't do each of these bullets. I don't know what to do. Well, you don't have to do each of the bullets. The bullets are examples of best practices or things that institutions might do to demonstrate compliance to the numbered item. But it's just to be moving toward that numbered item. As you know, especially with the regional accreditors, the goal is continuous improvement, reflective improvement, and if you have already been authorized by your regional accreditor, then you will necessarily be okay on C-RAC. You just need to bring that information so, again, that it makes sense, that you can verify that you're on top of this before you present that application to leadership. Student complaints. Once again, as I said, it must be easy for students to find. Cannot be too deeply embedded. Also, I recommend a fully searchable website. I know a lot of them aren't yet, but if we can all start moving in that direction so that students would just be able to search your website for complaints or SARA or state authorization and actually find those things, that is better for students, and therefore it's better for all of us. It's important, as I said, to distinguish between the SARA and the non-SARA complaint path. And actually, I provided a link to a blog where Cheryl Dowd of the Data Authorization Network and I wrote a little piece about that, so that should help you a little bit with that as well. You do want to provide information on other states' complaint agencies and processes. So even though with SARA, most of the SARA students, even though most of the SARA students are going to be going through the portal entity in your state, it is important, and again, with the new federal rules, will become increasingly important that you get those, the complaint agencies at the state level, grant some access to that for students on your website. Traditionally, there were a list of these housed on the SHIO, the State Higher Education Executive Officers Organization website, and that that list, I think the feds have said in the past that linking to that list was fine, but that list has not been maintained in the last few years. The State Authorization Network is working on an update of that list, so there should be something forthcoming in early 2018 that does give you a place to link so that you don't have to maintain the list of complaint agencies in other states. So watch out for that too. We'll put that in the M-SARA newsletter. And you also want to make sure that your complaint process and how it's chronicled on your website are reviewed and updated annually. There will be changes to federal and state laws, but sometimes you can just update the technology too. You might want to you might update the person they would contact, you might update the form they use, but just make sure that that is also on a cycle for review and update each year. Data reporting. You agree to data reporting when you agree to become a SARA institution. We have a data reporting manual that's on the NC-SARA website. That is done, the data reporting is done in May of each year. The definitions for the data we're collecting are aligned with the data definitions in IPEDS. So again, we're not asking for new information. And an invitation to submit data will be sent to all institutional contacts. So just like with the renewal invitation or renewal notice, if there is something wrong with your institutional contacts, whether someone has left or the contacts have not been updated, you could miss this invitation to submit data, and that would be problematic because it is one of the requirements of SARA participation. So again, make sure that people are getting that information and getting that data submitted in the appropriate time frame. There will be a change in 2018. There will be voluntary reporting of supervised field experiences that fall under SARA. That reporting will be mandatory as of 2019. The definitions and the specific guidelines for that have not come out yet, but the NC-SARA Data Committee will be working on that in early 2018. And if it's parallel to how it was last year, the new definitions and guidelines will probably come out sometime in March. A recommendation I always give to folks, because they generally have one main question when it comes to data reporting. They always ask, how am I supposed to know where my students are located, or how do you define that? And so I'll give the advice here that I give to everyone, which is create a data policy at your school. There probably already is one. And go through that policy to create a definition of student location. Remember that for state authorization purposes, it's not where the student lives or the official residence, it's actually where the learning takes place. And so you need to figure out how you want to monitor that, how you want to update that. You might update it once a year, once a term, or collect it at enrollment, but create the time frame and the definition and the process for collecting that data from students, and have it go through whatever process other data definitions and policies go through. Make sure it has a periodic review and that you're looking to see, well, is it working, is it accurate, etc. And just stick to that policy. That's the important thing, is that you are consistent internally with how you do this. And that way, when it is time to submit data to NC-SARA, you're going to have that information on student location. Professional licensure disclosures. again, I want to remind folks that SARA does not provide reciprocity for professional licensure among the states. So what SARA does is it allows you not to go through a separate procedure in another state as is ordained by their higher ed regulatory entity, whatever that might be, whatever the laws are. SARA has established reciprocity for those reasons. It has not established reciprocity between the boards of nursing or the boards of counseling psychology or any of those types of things. Those are still areas where the institution has to put in the work of finding out if its courses and programs do or do not lead to licensure in those other states. And SARA does require that its participating institutions comply with disclosure requirements that are aligned with the federal requirements and with the requirements that your regional and national accreditors have. And I'm just going to reissue the caution I mentioned earlier, is that there is a common misunderstanding of the SARA disclosure requirements. You should not be saying we cannot tell or we don't know if our program leads to licensure in the state where you, the student, are located unless you have made a huge and ongoing good faith effort to do so. It is only when you no longer you've reached an impasse and you need to disclose something to the student, that's where you would give the student the information for that licensure board and let the student know that he or she can pursue that information. However, here's another caution. That will no longer be an option if the new federal rules as scheduled for July 1st, 2018 go into effect as written. What will happen? We don't know. Again, I mentioned before, we're watching this carefully at SARA and responding once we know the direction things are headed. You also, when you agree to SARA, you agree to provide some alternatives to students. This is supposed to help students in the event that a school closes for some reason or something catastrophic happens like Hurricane Katrina. Specifically what this provision is referring to is, have you made good arrangements for the students' records? And I know that is a problem. It was a problem with Katrina. It's in the day of so much cloud service for all of our IT needs, most schools are able to move the records to a place that is not located with their physical location. But there are schools that are still in the process of doing that, looking for the resources, both human and financial, to get that accomplished. But you need to have that in place. Coincidentally, you also have to have that in place for your state authorization in your home state and for your accreditor. So if your school has something in place, it might be good for you as the compliance personnel to take a look and see what that is. You also, in a similar fashion, have to have teach-out plans. If for whatever reason a school or a program closes, you need to know who can take those students, where will your credits transfer, and who can help them finish the program that they signed up for. And there has to be some ability for financial compensation to students in the event that something catastrophic does happen and they have paid tuition for classes and education they have not yet received. Again, all of these things and requirements are embedded in accreditation policies, and this might be another place where you could go ahead and create a document or a notebook to show to your signatory officer if he or she is not aware of what, especially if they're new to the institution, they might not be aware of how your institution handles these things. Okay, that was a lot of information, but I'm good. Look at that. It's 1:59. I am ready to take some questions. I am going to have Emily Jacobson read them to me, and to the degree that I am able, I will answer them right now. And if I need to do more research on them, we'll get your information, and I will get back to you. So, Emily.
Hi, Jenny. So we don't have a ton of questions in yet. If other people have questions as we go along, feel free to fire them off via chat, and we'll get through them. First question is, what happens if someone signs off regarding the C-RAC guidelines, but they have been found not to be in compliance later?
Okay, well, found not to be in compliance later. So the question becomes, who's finding out that they're not in compliance? If you, as kind of the point person for SARA compliance, finds this out, then you're probably going to want to work with your accreditation liaison and anyone at the school who has your IT, your distance ed department, and create a plan for improving them and making them move forward. If you're found not to be in compliance, maybe later by your state portal entity or because of a student complaint, you could be looking at a complaint process there, where in general the way those things would work is most of these things that I've ever heard about, the portal entity would investigate and take a look at it and be looking for that same type of thing. Well, you don't have someone at your help desk? Well, hire someone for your help desk. Maybe hire a second person, or, you know, your server keeps crashing and people can't gain access, we'll update it. It really will depend on the nature of how that discovery is made, who makes it, and what it is. So, and if that didn't answer your question, email us again and with more specifics, and I'll attempt again.
Thanks, Jenny. The next question is, we're located in a SARA state. I thought all SARA students were to be directed to our state's portal agency with complaints, but were also to be given their own state's link because they could go there as well. Is that wrong?
We always recommend that you give them that other information for the state where they're located. The actual jurisdiction and deciding ability still lies with the portal entity for the state in which the school is located. However, it is great when portal agents can work across state lines and with each other. There are very few times where it's even necessary for the student to contact the portal entity in their own in the state where they're located, but sometimes that might make them feel better to know that people are triangulating in and trying to take care of them. Heretofore, I've never heard of the student state portal entity needing to get involved, but I do know that they like being notified by the portal entity of the state where the institution is located, so that they're just aware. So again, all these things are very rare anyway, but your initial understanding is correct, is that let's try to give students as much information as we can, but keep to the SARA process.
Perfect. Okay. Our next question is, does a change in school ownership affect SARA approval, or would the state portal agency handle that?
It depends on the way that ownership changes. So we are in an era where a lot of for-profit schools are changing either ownership or designation and becoming not-for-profit schools. And as long as where the owning entity remains, if they remain in the same state, then it's going to stay with that same portal entity and home state. If for whatever reason, look, we determine home state primarily based on where the accreditation lies. So I can conceive of a scenario, in fact I know of a scenario, where an entity in one state acquires an institution in another state and kind of rolls it into their existing accreditation. Then you begin to get into a stickier issue. In fact, we're looking at one of those right now with one of our states, and that just requires a little bit more discussion between portal entities and with NC-SARA, and those are the types of things that we spend a lot of time on, is figuring those types of things out. So again, if I didn't address some of the more specific scenarios you have in mind, please just continue to chat and we'll try to address those.
Perfect. Next question is, we are a community college. Our online programs do not lead to licensure, but some of our courses transfer in satisfaction of requirements in programs that lead to licensure. What are our disclosure obligations regarding professional licensure?
I always recommend that people do, and I can't tell, I'm not an attorney, I can't give you legal advice, but from a compliance perspective, I recommend a very conservative course there. If you have a set of courses you are pretty sure a good number of the students are taking, with some type of transfer into a program that does lead to licensure, I would go ahead and make some disclosures based in that course. It could be with the registration materials, it could be the first day of the class, but it could be a warning. If you are looking to transfer this course, in, thinking that you're going to transfer into a program for licensure in these areas, you might want to have a quick conversation with even just the licensure board in your own state to find out if it meets those requirements, and then as far as thinking about whether it would lead to those requirements in other states, that could be very, very difficult. So that's going to be one. Go ahead and contact me individually about that one, because I'd want to talk to you a little bit more about the types of courses. So for example, if it's basic math, no. I mean, that's kind of a ubiquitous course, and yes, you're going to need it in a professional licensure sequence, but no, you don't need to work on that. But there are going to be some specific courses that I can see where you might be turning the corner there and beginning to get into professional licensure. So let's talk about that offline and individually. And that would be one, if any of you out there have a situation like that, please reach out to us and we can begin to figure these things out.
Next question is, what are your recommendations regarding renewing SARA membership in light of PROSPER?
In light of what?
In light of PROSPER, P-R-O-S-P-E-R. It's the acronym.
Okay. I probably know what that is, but I'm drawing a blank. I'm looking it up. Help me out. What are we talking about? PROSPER.
It's the federal regulation for the new HEA program.
Yeah, okay, I know what you well, everything about the reauthorization of the Act and the way that they're changing things, we're not really sure about how all kinds of things are going to unfold. I would say SARA is still a lot of bang for the buck. You get a lot of coverage as far as risk management on all types of state authorization issues, and you get access to a community of people who are actively looking at these things. So unless it's a real financial hardship for your institution, in which case, yeah, maybe you do need to look a little more closely, I still think SARA is the best deal in town, and I would say definitely renew.
Okay, and then the last question we have is, any advice for what data schools have used to define student location?
I know I was just at the WCET conference in Denver earlier this year, and they were giving out awards for people who do good work in this. And the award went to the compliance shop at The Ohio State University. And they basically have a little field that pops up at registration time and says, in which state will you be located while taking these courses? And the student gives it, and and they take the student's word for it. And they do that with each registration period. It's pretty straightforward. It dumps it right into the database, and it allows them to do their data that way. I know not everyone can make those kinds of changes in their IT, so again, it could be part of an enrollment agreement when the student originally enrolls, but it is connecting it to registration seems to be the way more people are going, and it's just, students disclose that themselves. You're not required to go check out whether they're lying or not. You just have to have a systematic and rational way to collect that information.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jenny. One more question just came through, and it's, do you have a best practice for licensure notification process?
There are a lot of pieces that are going to be coming out in the first part of 2018 about best practices and licensure notifications. Look to the SAN network for that. They are working furiously on that to get that out, and I know that they will make some of it more broadly available. Those of you who have not necessarily looked into joining SAN, I recommend thinking about that. They are really the people who stay on top of this the most. Okay, so I did take a look at a couple more of the questions here. Okay, so you're talking about the higher ed authorization that was introduced last week, a federal regulation that makes federal state authorization void. So I'm not actually aware of whatever came out last week. I do know that December 19th, 2016, the federal rules on the regulation of state authorization did have some verbiage in it that seemed to weaken reciprocity. And as a result, the folks at NC-SARA reached out to the people in the department, and they did write a clarifying letter saying, no, the way it was written, maybe that was misconstrued. What we meant was, we like the idea of authorization, of reciprocity, and we think that's good. So I'm going to need to do a more careful read of the stuff that came out last week, and then if you wanted to email me maybe at the end of this week, I can take a look. I know that the best place to look at stuff like this, because I do know, and I haven't been able to read the most recent one, Russ Poulin's blog, Frontiers at WCET, did have something last week, so he likely has some really good information on that, and I do have links to that blog in the sheet accompanying this webinar.
That was all that we had for questions on this end, Jenny.
Excellent. Okay. Well, as always, folks, if you do have additional questions, let me know. I am happy to follow up and help you out. And again, hopefully this will be something that you can use for people who are new to your department, or even just people who want to understand what it's about. We always are trying to make sure that this is a process that works well for you. So thank you so much. There is an assessment that goes with this. We appreciate you letting us know what does and doesn't work about our webinars so that we can continue to improve them. All right. Thanks, everybody.